Hey, this is Patrick Murphy Racy, Sony Artisan of Imagery, welcoming you to another Friday night video. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the Sony 400mm 2.8 GMaster versus the Sony 600mm GMaster lens, and which to choose and why. And since I spend a ton of time with both of these lenses, I've got some sort of a keynote that I put together that I'm hoping will be helpful. So basically, we're going to go right into it. So what do the lenses both share? So when we talk about the GMaster primes, the big long primes, what do they both have? First, it's important to understand that these lenses were literally the first of their kind. There is no such thing as a 400 2.8 full frame mirrorless lens other than the GMaster 400. There's no 600mm f4 in existence anywhere in the world because Sony had to make them from scratch. They couldn't make them on any of the prior designs for DSLRs because of the flange back distance involved in mirrorless versus DSLR. Because there's no mirror flapping up and down, making a bunch of noise and making the camera bigger. In a mirrorless camera, you can move the rear element of glass towards the sensor much, much closer. And so none of the old designs for long glass worked when Sony began to create the GMaster lenses that we have now. So this is a really important thing. So like when you're talking about comparing lenses, it's important to remember that these have no peers. They don't exist anywhere. And they're literally designed for the A9 and the A7R4 and all that stuff. So second, the optical formulas had to be completely different. And on top of that, Sony employed a brand new, never before seen before autofocus motor that is what's called a linear motor. And what this means is that instead of the old way of focusing like this with a motor, the Sony lenses are in a track and they move directly back and forth without the screw motion. Now, the shortest distance between 2 points is always a straight line, and this takes longer than this does. And so, in effect, Sony has created a brand new autofocus technology that gives us sports photographers huge benefits because of the speed at which these cameras can autofocus utilizing this new linear focus autofocus lens. The second thing that's important to talk about these things is that the placement of the optical elements inside the lens and the various groups they're in is different. So these lenses have completely different balance than what you might be used to using Canon and Nikon long glass. They are balanced kind of in the middle of the lens rather than the front element being the heaviest part. They're also extremely lightweight and with better distribution of that weight. Last, the 400 and the 600 GMs are shorter, smaller, and easier to pack than their counterparts. So ultimately, what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about this 400mm GMaster first and its attributes, and then we're going to switch and talk about the 600 f4 GMaster lens and its attributes. So first, the 400 2.8. So the very first thing I want to say is the price. It's 12 grand US dollars, a little bit more in Canada. This lens has 23 elements and 17 groups. It is less expensive than the 600mm by $1,000. It's smaller, shorter, and easier to pack for sure, but it's way more versatile, allowing for a whole bunch of different focal lengths that start at 400mm. Because 400mm is a much wider field of view than 600mm, it is appropriate for a 400mm lens to be brought to more different types of events. So in sports photography, in my particular area, you can bring this lens to a high school football game, no problem. You can bring it to not just a baseball game, but you could go to a softball game. So if you shoot NCAA softball, no big deal. The 400 2.8 is ideal for shooting volleyball indoors or outdoors. The 600 f4 is really too long for any of those things I just mentioned. I also shot a ton of basketball throughout my career with a 400 2.8, sitting on the court, looking down court. So The 600 f4 is way too big, way too unwieldy, and just too long to pull that off. So the 400-2.8 is by default way more versatile than the 600 f4 because the 600 starts at 600 millimeter, and then you can add teleconverters or do the APS-C function punch in. But ultimately, there's just more versatility. So the 400-2.8 is better suited for certain sports. And in nature photography, as an example, shooting an eagle on a nest in the wild versus in a zoo is radically different. So, you know, the longer lenses, the 600 f4 is going to be much better for doing an eagle on a nest in the wild. Whereas the 400-2.8 might be a better choice if you're going to go around the San Diego Zoo and shoot stuff. You're going to be much closer than you could ever get in the wild, obviously. And then I put in equestrian because, you know, shooting horses, whether it's polo or whatever, shooting horses is difficult in rodeo. 400-2.8 is probably going to be better. The rodeos are notoriously dark indoor. You know, the pro rodeos are kind of dark. And, of course, they're playing on dirt instead of like a shiny basketball floor. So all these things kind of add up to the 400-2.8 being ideal for that. Next, the 600 f4. So the 600 f4 is $1,000 more at 13 grand. It has 24 elements and 18 groups. It's longer, but about the same weight as the 400-2.8, but still very, very lightweight. It offers even less depth of field at 600 millimeter than the 400 millimeter 2.8 does. This is a very important point that I want to make sure I bring home. When people say, hey, the 400-2.8 is way more versatile, they're absolutely right. But when they then say, I'm going to add the 1.4 converter and the 2x to get 800 5.6 and 560 f4, they're correct in that they're going to get the field of view of those other two lenses, but they're not going to get the depth of field of a 600 millimeter lens. They're not going to get the depth of field of an 800 5.6 prime. Radically different. So remember that when you commit to buying a 400-2.8, for an example, you are locking into the depth of field that that lens has. The characteristics are inside that lens. They're never going to change no matter what teleconverter you add or if you use APS-C zoom. So that being said, I want to point out that when you have a 600 f4, you start out there, you have way less depth of field. So there's less in focus, which means by default that your backgrounds are more out of focus than they would be at the same distance with a 400-2.8. So the 600 f4 is definitely superior in terms of what it can do to a background, blow it out to smithereens, very easily done with a 600. A 400-2.8 is still going to do a great job of that, but not to the same extent the 600 f4 will do. Now, if we go back one slide, I want to show you what I'm talking about. So when people say it's more versatile, they always bring up the teleconverters. So if you are going to shoot, for instance, the 400-2.8 with a 1.4 converter, you're going to be at 560 millimeter field of view at f4. If you shoot the 400-2.8 GM on an A9 and you punch into APS-C, you're going to be at 600 millimeter field of view with a 2.8 aperture. If you use a 2x converter, you're going to be at 800 millimeter 5.6, but you're really going to be, you'll have the field of view of an 800, but not the depth of field of an 800. And finally, if you add the 2x to the 400-2.8 GM and do the punch-in APS-C, you're going to be at 1200 millimeter field of view. But if you go back here and compare the difference here, we start at 600 millimeter as a prime. When we add the 1.4 and go to 5.6, we're at 840 millimeter. You go to 900 millimeter if you just do the APS-C zoom, which would be an f4, 900 millimeter f4. Pretty cool, especially when the light's getting low. If you add the 2x converter to the 600, you get 1200 millimeter, obviously. And if you add the 2x and the APS-C punch-in, you get to 1800 millimeter, which is pretty impressive. So just remember that there's way less depth of field in a 600 f4 than a 400-2.8 at the same distance. So while it's not as versatile as the 400 GM, the 600 GM offers much better bokeh behind more distant subjects. And for some, this thing alone is worth the price of admission. Sorry, I put along, but it means alone. So I want to kind of go into more detail about that. But I'm going to do that in the next slide. Last, the lens shade on the 600 f4 GM is longer and deeper, and that makes it much better for the rain. Because once your front element gets, if the wind kicks up and it's raining real hard, you get that front element wet, you're toast. You got to go dry it off if you have something dry, and then you got to come back out and try it again. So the deeper lens shade really helps a lot. Okay, so which one is actually better? Now, this is where we kind of may part company because what you do is different from what I do, and that's okay. But the 600mm GM is better than the 400-2.8 GM because it just has less depth of field. It produces more eye candy faster than the 400 because of its focal length and its speed. But you can't always use it if you're too close. So when using it for sports, you often have to put it away. What do I mean by that? If I'm shooting American soccer and I'm at the goal line on one end of the field and I'm shooting them shooting on goal on the opposite side of the field, it's way, way far away. The 600 f4 is going to be able to do a little bit better with autofocus at great distance because it has less depth of field. And it's going to be less likely to jump off of what I want and onto something I don't, for sure. The other thing that's really important is if you shot next to each other, if you shot a 400-2.8 GM with a 1.4 on it, right next to a 600 f4 in the same position, what you'd notice if you shot all the way down the field at the goal behind the goalie, and especially the chain link fence, which is maybe 25 or 30 feet behind the goal, is going to be much more out of focus on the 600 shot than the 560 converted 400 GM shot. So when you have so much less depth of field that you earned in millimeters in a 600 versus 400 millimeter, the autofocus system is actually going to work better with the longer lens when the subject is much farther away. They're going to be about the same at kind of mid distance, say half field or whatever. But when you're really going out there far away, the 600 f4 is actually going to be a better performer and give you more in sharp frames than the 400-2.8 will with converters. So a lot of people kind of might have a problem with me saying that, but I'm telling you, I've got them both. I've used them both a ton. I mean, hundreds of thousands of images, and this is not anything different with Sony. It's like it's just optics. So basically, discerning shooters in nature will always prefer the 600mm look over the 400-2.8 because the background foliage or whatever's behind the animal or bird you're shooting, it's going to be more pleasant because you're going to separate so much easier those things. Both lenses, the 400-2.8 and the 600, both equally acquire autofocus quickly. They're super quick, lightning's fast. But the 600 GM will be more accurate than the 400 with teleconverters at distant objects and like birds in flight and stuff like that. So one of the things I love to do is use both lenses for football. And what I'll typically do is use the 600mm with a 1.4 extender on it, which gives me the 840 5.6 as my super long lens. I can stay in the end zone the entire game and cover the whole game from there. When they pass about the 40-yard line on my end of the field, I'll put the 6 down and pick up the 400-2.8 as a prime and shoot that. And then I generally go to like a 50mm or 55 around my neck for the oh crap if it like comes to my end zone. But I like to shoot tight. Now, if you're doing news work, you're not going to want to be that tight, and a 400-2.8 probably is a better choice for you. But for me, I love shooting super, super tight. I love the 600. I'm hoping Sony makes an 800 5.6 sooner than later. But anyway, that's another video. So I love to use both lenses for football, and the nice thing is they're not heavy. You can really get away with it, no problem. I mean, I'm 55 years old. I've been doing this a long time. My knees aren't what they were. My back isn't what it was. And I have no problem using the 4 and the 6 at the same time because everything is so lightweight and better balanced without all the weight being on the front element. It's really easy to get up from a kneeling position and then truck it down if there's an interception or something like that. All that stuff works great. So I really enjoy using both lenses at games. But honestly, for most people that are looking at long glass, the 400-2.8, because of its versatility, might be a better choice. But if you are doing something all the time that requires greater telephoto resolving power, and you like to blow out those backgrounds, you just can't beat the 600 f4 GMaster. It's just the bomb, man. It's awesome. And I wanted to talk briefly about weight and cost. So in this little comparison here, I'm going to punch it up. We have the A9 II with grip and the 600mm lens with only weighs 9 pounds combined. So that's the grip, 2 batteries, a card, the lens shade, all that only weighs 9 pounds. The 1DX Mark III with their brand new 3 version 600 f4L lens is 9.9 pounds. And as you can see, a whole lot more money. The Nikon D6 with a Nikkor 600mm f4 FL lens is a full 11 pounds. And it costs about $1,000 more than the A9 II with grip and 600 GM. So not only is the Sony a better deal, you're also getting away with a whole lot less weight. In the 400mm 2.8 range, the A9 with grip and 2 batteries and a card and a 400 GMaster lens weighs in at 8.67 pounds, and it'll cost you $16,500. The 1DX Mark III with the 400-2.8 3 version lens is 9.4 pounds. So a little bit heavier, but it's $2,000 more. And finally, the D6 with the FL version 400mm 2.8 Nikkor lens weighs in at a whopping 11.2 pounds. Now, I want to be fair, this is very light compared to what we've had in the past, but it's still not as good as Sony or Canon. And that's $17,700 basically. So bottom line, it costs you more money to carry more weight, which doesn't make sense in this day and age, especially if you want to elongate your tenure as a shooter. The last thing I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of speak directly to Canon shooters first and then to Nikon photographers, because some of you are hearing the buzz about Sony. Some of you have friends that have switched and they love it and you're sick and tired of hearing them talk about it. I get it. So there's 2 different messages I have, one for Canon shooters, one for Nikon. So I'm going to do the Canon first because it's frankly easier. So here we go. So you can soft switch from Canon very easily by just buying the Sigma MC11 adapter. It ranges in price. When it's on sale, it's $150. Normally it's $249. But when you put that adapter on an A9 II, you will get 10 frames per second instead of 20. So I want to be upfront about that. But you'll be able to use all of your existing telephotos, and they'll work great. They'll autofocus really fast and follow and track action really well. And for that reason, a lot of people just can't afford to just switch everything at once. And so usually what they'll do is they'll start peddling bodies and short glass, and that's a great way to do it. So you could go into the A9 II first and then get maybe a couple zooms or whatever you're going to do. And then as you sell off a lens, you can replace it with a Sony counterpart. You really are going to be in 2 systems in terms of glass. So in other words, you're going to have access as a Sony shooter to everything Canon has ever made that's autofocus, plus anything that Sigma and Tamron have made in Canon mount as well. So we're talking about hundreds of lenses that are now in your purview. But just remember that as well as the MC11 works, just don't kid yourself about knowing how good the A9 II is until you shot the 400 GM or the 600 GM. They just smoke everything. So just bear that in mind. Nikon shooters is a little more difficult because Nikon shooters, there really is not a sports action ready adapter that anyone has made. Now, the people in China have cranked out a whole bunch of relabeled adapters that they say will work with Nikon glass to Sony E-mount, but really there's not confidence in any of those. And I just would say flat out, you can't shoot sports with it. It's just not going to work for sports assignments or birds in flight or anything like that. So as you consider this route, one of the things you can do, and this will sound weird, but if you want to switch from Nikon to Sony, one of the things you might be able to do is your glass, your Sony long glass, is typically worth more money than the same glass in Canon. There's fewer lenses out there in Nikon used than the Canon. Canon's got lenses everywhere. And because the supply is so great, the demand is less, which means the prices are less too. So one of the things you could do as a Nikon shooter is, let's say you have a 400-2.8 FL lens. Well, that lens is worth probably twice as much as a used 2-version Canon 400-2.8L. So you could actually move short term, maybe for a year, from your Nikkor lens into a Canon lens, pick up an A9 II and a grip, and now you're shooting sports with a 400-2.8. You haven't lost that 400-2.8. And typically the 2-version lenses you can buy for $6,000-7,000, so about half of what we're talking about for the 400 GM and the 600 GM. So I know it's weird, but it is a sort of a side switch. I call that the side switch versus the soft switch. It's easy to do it in Canon, but it's harder to do it in Nikon because there just isn't a way to adapt those lenses. Now, there's plenty of adapters that let you manually focus all you want, and that'll work great. So for your macro lens, you may not want to switch that at all, although the 90G lens is incredible in the macro side of Sony, but I digress. But anyway, let it suffice to say that you can do it with Nikon glass, and there is that possibility. So what most people do, though, is they switch everything below 200mm first, and then they kind of bide their time. They learn the A9 II, the menus, and they learn how to use the real-time tracking autofocus system, which will blow you away. It is awesome. And then as you're able to get your long glass, figured out, maybe you can get to Sony or whatever. So last, I wanted to kind of do a shout out here. I work with a lot of camera stores. There's a lot of really wonderful camera stores that are still in business and are struggling through COVID. And one of my favorites is Bedford's over in Arkansas and Oklahoma. And if you want to purchase a 400 GM or a 600 F4 GM, you can get 5% off, which is a lot of juice. It's a lot of coin. I'll let you do the math, but all you do is when you go to checkout, you just put in the code PMR and you'll get 5% off. The other thing is if you're going to go used and you're going to try and find maybe, like to just get some used gear or sell some stuff or trade some stuff, usedphotopro.com is owned by Roberts Distributors in Indianapolis, and they're fantastic people. I've done business with them for 30 years. They're wonderful. They have the largest selection of used camera equipment anywhere in the world by probably 10 miles. So if there's something you're looking for, they probably have it, and they may have multiple copies of it at different price points. So I would encourage you to go to usedphotopro.com. But if you're going to buy new, man, go to Bedford's and get 5% off. Just use that code PMR when you check out. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you for kind of sitting through this. I'm hoping that some of the information has been useful to you. If it has been, please like it and subscribe. And most important, if you just please share the video on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you're at, Twitch. I'm trying to grow this YouTube channel so that I can justify doing more videos like this. So if you benefited from this, help me help you. So subscribe to my channel, like the video, and if you have any questions or comments, even if you disagree with me, as long as you're cool about it, I'm going to engage with you in the comment section below. So please feel free to look at my other videos that I've made on the similar topics. And but most of all, thanks for watching. I do slightly longer videos than most people on YouTube, but I try to pack them with real information and real experience of mine as a shooter for the last 30 years. So last and not least, thank you so much for watching. I'm Patrick Murphy-Racy, Sony Artisan of Imagery, saying just thanks and be safe out there. Thanks so much.